morning, everyone. My name's Lauren Grand, and I'd like to welcome you back to our next session of the Society of American Foresters annual meeting in Oregon. I'll be your moderator for the general session 1. I'm an extension agent with Oregon State University, and I serve Lane County. Our next session is entitled Forested Ecosystem Services, and we wanted this session to be a general discussion of the different services that forests provide in addition to trees and timber. I'm excited to introduce to you our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Robert Deal. Bob Deal retired after spending more than 40 years as a research forester and science team leader for the Forest Service, the Pacific Northwest Research Station in Portland, Oregon. He worked as a forester and a silviculturist in Washington and Alaska, and a research forester in Oregon. He's an internationally recognized authority for ecosystem services, applied silviculture, and sustainable forest management. And we're so excited how active he is in our society, and excited to introduce him for his talk on the benefits of ecosystem services. Help me welcome Bob.
Okay, can you guys hear me or see me maybe?
We can see you and hear
I'll get my, okay, thank you. I'll look at share my screen here, but that's great, Lorna. I retired last year after 40 years with the Forest Service. And get this here loaded up here, but you know, I've ended all of my, from beginning, let's see. Okay, sorry. But I've ended all my Forest Service and university and IUFRO, International Forest Research things, but I still am remaining active in SAF. It's an important part of my identity, and so I'm glad to serve, and really delighted to be here to give this talk. Okay, as you see, the name of the talk is the benefits of ecosystem services provided by private and public forests. I'm going to move through this fairly quickly. Basically, give you a working definition for ecosystem services, talk about some of the emerging markets for these services, talk about water and carbon in particular, and then how this ecosystem services concept is used on public lands and some recent federal legislation. And then lastly, talk about how the Forest Service is using ecosystem services in national programs and planning to forest and project scales. So just the first thing, you know, what are ecosystem services? Broadly speaking, these are the benefits people receive from nature. This word means different things to different people. If you talk to ecologists, biologists, foresters, they tend to think of this as the things that come from nature. But if we talk to social scientists, economists, they tend to think of this term as more like the values that people receive from nature. Both are right, but it's really a broad-serving definition. And so it includes things like commonly recognized things like clean air and water, fire and flood mitigation, climate regulation, fish and wildlife habitat, and then things like recreation, economic benefits, forest bathing, as we heard from our speakers there. And a lot of these benefits are either undervalued or unrecognized. So, for example, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment looked at, put these services in 4 broad categories. They include provisioning services. These are the commonly recognized things like water quantity, food and medicines, timber, fiber, range, fish and wildlife habitat. Regulating services, not just climate regulation, but watershed services like water quality, flood control, carbon sequestration. This other area, cultural services, we heard about from like forest bathing, but these include things like aesthetic values, spiritual values, cultural heritage values, recreation. And then this last category, supporting services. These are the ones that all these services really depend on. Things like nutrient cycling, soil formation, pollination services. And whether you agree with this typology of categories from blame assessment, it's led to what I call emerging markets for these services, particularly on private lands. And things like water quality trading, wetland mitigation, and species conservation banking, a lot of voluntary services, including carbon and biodiversity. And this really focuses mostly these markets on private lands. Public lands, a different beast, if you will. But these markets are sort of three broad categories. They include compliance markets based on environmental regulations, water quality trading, wetland mitigation, species conservation banking. Really depend on environmental regulations. The second category is what I call voluntary markets. Carbon right now in the U.S. is really a voluntary market, but it's really surprising it even exists in a lot of ways, because it's really about the desires either from buyers or sellers to do the right thing for nature. Okay, and then government payment programs. I'll just mention this briefly. This is like the CREP program, a number of government programs that pay landowners to improve their lands, to get better conservation value, etc. So I'll talk a little bit about, well, first, these drivers for compliance markets. In particular, some of these acts that came about in the 1970s, the Endangered Species Act led to species conservation banking. The Clean Water Act led to water quality trading and wetland mitigation banking. And I'll talk a little bit about one of these, which really in the U.S. is a voluntary market for carbon. Most folks realize that CO2 emissions released mostly come from the burning of fossil fuels, from natural gas, petroleum, and coal. But globally, about 20% of all CO2 emissions come from deforestation, either cutting down forest for agriculture or maybe cutting down forests for housing development, etc. And if deforestation is one of the problems of CO2 emissions, forestry can be one of the solutions. So you can get forestry offsets, at least theoretically, by avoided conversion. Instead of cutting down trees to do housing developments, maybe you can get some forest offsets that way. I haven't really seen this in practice, but you might also get avoided emissions credits from if you can reduce the risk of wildfires. Okay, maybe have some sort of a forestry offset for that. Okay. Also, more commonly, carbon forest offsets can be used either to preserve existing large pools of carbon, like in older forests, let's say, or for improved forest management or increased carbon sequestration by better managed forests that more rapidly sequester carbon than you would normally do. Okay, a couple of ideas of forestry offsets. I will mention this California. California has a fairly robust forest offset programs. My data is a little bit old here, but there were about almost 40 projects across the U.S. A few years ago that did things like reforestation, avoided conversion, get credits for that. Mostly it was used on improved forest management in a lot of different categories. This is in California, but I noticed recently that the state of Washington has gotten some carbon credits from their DNR lands on older forests that are being preserved, not for timber management, but just basically on carbon, let's say. So there's that way you can do that as well. So that's carbon. I want to talk a little bit about another market that really is a compliance market, and this is water. And so here's a picture of the Willamette Valley. In Western Oregon during the summer, water utilities required by law to not only have clean water that's released back into streams, but actually have the water be cooled. Water temperature is a compliance that is required for water utilities to reduce the temperature of water that's before it's released back into streams. And water utilities can either do this through building chilling towers or cooling plants to reduce the water during the summertime, at least, before it's released back into streams. And this is a fairly expensive and big effort. Another opportunity that could do, instead of building these water cooling towers, you could pay farmers and ranchers to plant trees on riparian zones. The idea is that these trees will grow up and naturally shade the stream and reduce the water temperature sort of naturally, if you will. So this is opportunity for doing something that would be different than building water cooling towers. So the idea here is you can either invest in gray infrastructure, building cooling towers. They're expensive. It does meet your compliance target of water temperature reduction, but doesn't have much ecological value other than just cooling the water. Alternatively, you can invest in restoration of streams or riparian boundaries, which costs less, but also provides much more ecological uplift. Not just cool water only, but also improve fisheries habitat, wildlife habitat along the streams. So this is an opportunity to do something different than regular compliance market does for water temperature. Okay, that's all I'll say about water. But there's been an interest also in what we call bundling or combining different ecosystem services to increase value. So the challenge here is that each of these regulatory silos, like water quality, is controlled and regulated by the EPA. Wetland mitigation banking is controlled and regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers. Fish and wildlife habitat is controlled by the Fish and Wildlife Service or NIMS fisheries. But anyway, each of these little silos have their own market, drivers and controllers, and it's pretty complicated to get involved with one market, let alone multiple markets. So there was a really good effort done about 10 years ago through the Willamette Partnership, which basically this counting on the environment thing. They got basically virtually all of the federal and state regulators to agree on a set of protocols for 4 different markets. So on a single piece of land, or a landowner could get involved with water quality trading, wetland mitigation, salmonid, and prairie habitat in a combined sort of ecosystem services credit, if you will. And it's you can look at this reference here, talk about that. But basically, it was the best example I've seen on really a broad national ecosystem services credit accounting protocol for different markets. Okay, that's all I'll say about markets. And really, the markets really apply to private lands predominantly, not federally or public lands. But as we all know, these services are more than just markets, particularly on public lands. There's a lot of things like fish and wildlife habitat, recreation, hiking and walking, let's say, different services that come from public lands that really is more than just markets. And I'll talk briefly on a couple opportunities that they do on public lands. The 2012 Forest Service Planning Rule, for the first time, started mentioning the word ecosystem services. There was this federal decision-making process that occurred in the Obama administration that was largely ignored during the Trump administration, but it was an important effort at that point. And then I'll talk a little bit of detail about this National Ecosystem Services Strategy Team, or NEST. That was something that I was leading at the national level for a few years. So in this Forest Service Planning Rule, before the recent planning rule, we had this, what we call Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, which really planners had to consider these 5 values: timber, water, recreation, range for cattle and sheep, and fish and wildlife habitat. Those are the only sort of services that used to come from planning. In this last 2012 planning rule, for the first time, you started to hear the word ecosystem services. and they had it in a combined ecosystem services and multiple uses. And you started to hear this thing, and this new effort included other values that weren't in multiple use, cultural heritage values, other services like carbon that were not traditionally in part of the multiple use sustained yield act. And lastly, in the 2015 directives for planners, they said that national forests should include KEY, ecosystem services in forest plan revisions. So this is an important change in the agency for planning purposes. The other effort, I mentioned this earlier, was this National Ecosystem Services Strategy Team. And I was involved in this effort for about 8 years before I retired. They had a fairly strong mission statement. It was that the National Ecosystem Services Strategy Team was established to collaboratively develop national strategy and policy around ecosystem services and integrated into Forest Service programs and operations. Really a fairly powerful mission statement of what we were involved with. And this led to this report that came out about 3 years ago. I'll talk about it in a little more detail here, but really there was 3 main areas: in planning, in performance, and in partnerships. Okay, I'll give some examples of that. So in planning, considering the full suite of objectives and analysis, decision-making, and priority setting, both at the forest planning level, at project planning levels, and then how they prioritize restoration activities, and then this area of state forest action plans. So, for instance, when planning was involved with, they get involved with assessments, and this is a word cloud that looked at, talking to stakeholders, what they thought were the most important services that come from this forest area. And the larger the word, the more often it was mentioned, or more important it was to the stakeholders. So you see like things like water and carbon and recreation as being really important. Things like timber and soil and I think were important, but not as mentioned as often, or maybe as important as the other things like water and carbon and cultural services. So, for instance, in terms of water, there's an effort that was done called the Forest to Faucets Project, where they looked at where water originated on lands and where it got to the a landowner's faucet in their homes. And one thing that people don't realize, about 30% of all the clean drinking water in the United States originates on either Forest Service or BLM lands. It's really a large amount of water that comes from public lands. Okay. And then this other area of state forest action plans, which are required under the U.S. Farm Bill to preserve working forest lands, enhance public benefits from trees and forests. This is part of the planning effort that was involved with this NEST effort. And then the second one, performance, quantifying and communicating the value of resources and impacts of management actions in terms of benefits to people. So, basically creating this standardized metrics, indicators on how the agency was doing on meeting their goals and as such. Okay. And then the last area, big area of partnerships, connecting providers and beneficiaries of ecosystem services through partnerships and investments. So, for instance, on Forest Service lands, we're not directly involved with markets, but we do encourage private lands to do these environmental markets and such. Okay. So one example here, great beer in Oregon takes clean water, and so the Deschutes National Forest has, for some of their beer, they provide a few cents per keg of beer, every keg of beer, which goes into restoration activities to make sure that the water they get for their breweries is the best, the cleanest water possible. That's maybe a brewshed investment, I call this. Okay, so that's at the national level. But at a forest scale level, I'm going to give a little bit of talk about this effort we did about 10 years ago on the Deschutes. basically calling ecosystem services as a framework for forest stewardship. And basically, we had 4 primary goals with this effort. It may seem straightforward, but it was to first clearly explaining the values that forests provide to the public. It may seem obvious, but in a lot of ways, the agency and their partners didn't really clearly explain all the values that come from national forests, okay? Secondly, evaluating effects between management actions and the delivery of these different ecosystem services, okay? And then this is probably one of the most important parts is building this ecosystem services-based partnerships to design and fund work on the ground. And then lastly, creating some tools for managers to assess the outcomes and trade-offs of different services around resource areas and over long time scales. So for example, some of these services are easily quantified and monetized. Some of the other ones are more qualitative. So for instance, how much is a breeding pair of spotted owls worth? Now, some people say that this may be priceless, but there's different services that are easily quantified and some that are more qualitative, if you will. And then this area, I think this is the most successful part of this thing, is that a lot of our partners really understood this concept much better than the agency people, I have to admit, did as well. And not just conservation groups, but economic development people like the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council, the Bend Water Utility. They all understand that there's a lot of valuable services that come from public lands, and they need to be recognized. So, in summary of this thing, the benefits of an ecosystem services approach, it's an integrated approach. It allows managers to assess the costs and benefits of projects across resource areas and beyond forest boundaries. It creates awareness about the services provided by public lands and brings attention to particularly undervalued projects. And then it leverages partnerships and funds to implement work needed on the ground. So in summary here, John Allen, who's now also retired forest supervisor, he was a big supporter and fan of this concept. He thought that using this concept to frame management was like going from black and white to color, that it clearly articulates the values that come from public lands and in a way that really resonates with the public. So he was a champion in my mind on this whole eco-services concept. And then I think I'm hopefully about done here. This is my last slide. That ecosystem services highlight the importance of nature for human well-being and investments in restoration. Markets and payment programs use financial incentives to restore ecosystems, particularly on private lands. And these programs that couple livelihood improvements with natural resource stewardship are particularly successful in doing so. And this last bullet is something I gave in an international presentation. It may sound kind of strange, but ecosystem services is a powerful tool to support collaborative landscape scale restoration and to provide long-term well-being for future generations, a concept that was really important part of this whole conference. So that's about it for my talk. I went through this fairly quickly, but hopefully there's some time for questions.
Okay, thank you so much. We do have time for questions. Please get your questions in the Q&A box. We don't have any right now, but hopefully people are just thinking and typing. Any questions for Bob? We can't let him off easy.
Yeah. So this is basically a general talk on what ecosystem services are and how they can be of value to different people. We heard from the earlier talk today about the forest bathing. That certainly is a kind of an ecosystem service. But you have more tangible services like timber and water and recreation and regulation sort of thing, but it really includes a lot of values that are beyond what we typically think of coming from forests. And for private landowners, there is some markets for, I call emerging markets, for other services that are more than just water and timber. So are there any other questions here for folks?
There is one more that just came up here, Lauren, by Siobhan.
Thanks. Sorry, I was on mute. We've got one more question. Okay, practical applications for forest landowners to access ecosystem service markets.
I mean, so these markets are complicated, but I think basically, if you're interested, let's say, in water, water markets, let's say, or wetland mitigation, basically, talk to the regulator that's involved in that. So wetland mitigation would be the Army Corps of Engineers, but there might be some local services that would be involved in that, and see what it would involve in getting involved with wetland mitigation. So the thing is, basically they have trading areas for wetlands, let's say, where a landowner can get involved with, by increasing an acre of land, let's say, it's fairly valuable. So like, let's say when Walmart comes in and builds a store, they damage a part of a wetland area. They're required by law to control that, to either offset or buy other wetlands that replace the area they lost of wetlands. There's a no net loss regulation that's required. So they have to either buy another wetland or pay money into another wetland to replace the area of land that was lost. And it's fairly valuable. On average, an acre of wetland is worth about $100,000. That's a lot of money. But there is some things that go along with that. If they replace that with a person that's involved with wetland mitigation, a company, let's say, they're required to contribute that wetland in perpetuity, and that means like forever. Forever is a long time. So they get a lot of money for that wetland, but they're required by law to maintain that wetland forever. So there's a fairly sizable commitment to be involved in that. But Siobhan, there are other markets you can get involved with, but I would just talk to the local utilities or regulators to see what you could do to get involved in that. Carbon markets is much more straightforward, but right now that's basically a voluntary market. You talk to some of the folks that get involved with pooling together carbon on lands, you can see what you might do to get carbon credits, let's say, for that land as well. Hope that answers the question somewhat.
Okay, we got a couple more questions that snuck in here. So what are your thoughts on demanding ecosystem services from private landowners without compensation? For example, some of the things that might have come out of the private forest accord.
Demanding services from private landowners without compensation. So you mean like requirements, let's say, to meet water temperature compliance or wetland mitigation, that sort of thing? I mean, some of the compliance markets, you are required by law to do certain things on lands to maintain those services. So, without compensation, I think that if you do the improvements or maintain those services, you can be compensated for those. But I'm not sure what, example, PFA. Not sure what that is. PFA.
It's the private forest accord.
Okay. So you mean you don't get any? So I'm not really familiar with the private forest accord. Is there? You don't get any compensation for doing work on private lands for that accord, or I'm not sure how to answer that, I guess.
Okay, Well, let's, we're out of time anyway. So why don't we, Bob, see if you can maybe answer the two other questions that came up. If you can type an answer to those or put them in the chat, and we'll thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your talk on ecosystem services. And we'll move on to our next speaker.